In this first lesson, we're going to model the basic shape of the outer frame of the blast door. First of all, I want to go to my picture viewer and I want to load some renders that I did of the final version of my model. And these images are called Final 01 and Final 02. I'm going to switch the type of these images to still image. Let's go ahead and load the second image here. I will be using these as a reference from time to time, so I want to be able to quickly access them here in the picture viewer. Next, what I want to do is add a reference image that we can use for modeling, and I've prepared one. So let's go to the front view, and I want to go to Options, Configure, and over here on the back tab we can load an image into the background. And this image I want to use is called refouterframe.png. Now, because I want to model big, I'm going to change the size of this image to 1600 by 800 here, and I want to offset it on the y-axis so the outer frame sits on the floor. Let's go ahead and move this up to something like 397. All of the reference images I've prepared have an alpha channel that we can use. So let's go ahead and switch the alpha mode to normal to get rid of the black background. As you can see, this outer frame is completely symmetrical, which is good because we only need to model part of the object, and we can then mirror this object over to the left, and then we can grab everything and mirror it over from the front to the back. I want to start modeling this outer frame by creating a simple outline using a spline. And I would like to show you two possible ways of creating that simple outline. So we're going to model two different versions of the same outline. For the first version, I'm going to use some of the new snapping features available in release 14. So you will need release 14 to be able to do that. And for the second version, I'm going to use a technique that can also be used in release 13. I want to start with the R14 version. So let's go ahead and hit the P key on the keyboard, which will bring up the snapping menu. I'm going to undock this. Let's switch on snapping, and we need to snap to vertices, which is enabled by default. We also need guide snap, dynamic guide, and perpendicular snap here. I'm going to use a linear spline to create this outline. So let's zoom in to the bottom of this reference image here and left click in the viewport to create the first point. And now we can left click again to create another point, and make sure you see that dynamic guide. This means that this point is lined up with the previous one. And I'm just going to slide this over and use the y-axis to line it up with the edge over here. Now let's zoom in to the top corner here and create another point. And I want to create another point maybe over here, and another one over here. And now we need to create one more point, and this last point needs to be lined up with this one on the y-axis and with this one down here on the x-axis. So what I'm going to do is left click in the viewport to create the point, and I'm going to snap it to this point down here. Then I'm going to slide it up along the dynamic guide until I see this dynamic guide perpendicular snap. And this means that this point is lined up with this one and with this one. And now we can just left click on the first point we created down here to close the spline. Let's go ahead and switch off snapping. And I'm using the rectangle selection tool to grab these points and adjust the position of these points if you have to. But I think we're doing fine here. close enough, and that's the first version. Now let's make this spline invisible by switching it off here in the object manager. If you hold down the Alt key, you can switch these points, both of these little dots here, simultaneously. Now let's go ahead and create the second version. For this second version, we're not going to use snapping, but we will need a linear spline again. So let's go ahead and grab one. And again, I'm going to zoom in to the bottom of my reference image here and left click to create the first point. Now, in order to line the other points up, I'm going to use a feature called Quick Extrude, which I think was introduced in release 13. The way Quick Extrude works is you hold down the Control key, left click and drag on the x-axis in this case to create a new point that is lined up with the previous one. So I'm just going to slide this one over, line it up with the edge over here. And then we can use Quick Extrude again, hold down the Control key, left click and drag on the y-axis to create a new point that is lined up with this one on the x-axis. And now we can go ahead and move this point up to the top of the frame here and use Quick Extrude again to create another point. I'm going to move this one over to here, and I'm going to use Quick Extrude again to create one more point here, and let's use Quick Extrude one more time to create our last point. So all of these points except for the last one and this one down here will be lined up, and in order to close the spline, what we need to do here is left click on the first point down here and then left click on the last point we created up here. And usually you can close the spline by just left clicking on the first point you created, but when you use Quick Extrude that doesn't seem to work. Let me just zoom in to the bottom here. Sometimes when you left click on this point down here, if you don't click on it, if you don't click exactly on the point, what happens is that you create another point. So in case that's what happened, just select one of these points and delete it. I'm going to use the rectangle selection tool now to grab both of these points. We need to line these up, and I'm going to hit T for scale and left click on the x-axis and drag, and then I'm holding down the shift key to scale in increments, and I'm going to scale this down to 0. And now I can grab my move tool again by hitting E on the keyboard, and I can adjust the position of these points. Okay, so this is another way of creating this simple outline. I'm going to delete this spline again and make my first spline visible again. Let's go ahead and grab the rectangle selection tool, select this point. Next I want to create this curved corner here. So let's right click in the viewport and select chamfer, zoom in a little closer, and now we can just left click and drag in the viewport until the shape of the spline matches up with what we have in our reference image here. And I'm going to grab these 2 points here and just move them over to 0 on the x-axis. Now let's go ahead and select these 2 points. What I want to do next is create a number of segments for this corner. Eventually this outer frame will be subdivided using hyperNURBS, and I want to be able to control how many segments I get for this corner here. We don't want to use too many segments because we're going to use subdivision surfaces later on. But on the other hand, we can't use too few segments either because we have quite a bit of geometry coming down from here, and more geometry will be created by these circular details over here. So the question is, how many segments do we need? At this point, it really just boils down to taking a wild guess. Like I said, I don't want to use too few segments because of the additional geometry we will have here, but we can't use too few segments either. So I've decided to go for 16 segments, which will probably not be exactly what we need, but we'll just have to improvise as we go along later. So how do we get our 16 segments here? Well, we can right click in the viewport, and all the way at the bottom you see this subdivide option. Let's go ahead and click on this little icon here, which will bring up the options window. And because I want 16 segments, I'm just going to type in 16 subdivisions here and hit OK. Right now this spline is a Bezier spline with intermediate points set to adaptive, and we have this angle here which basically defines the smoothness of the curve. If we put this spline in an extrude NURBS object now and convert it, what happens is that because we have intermediate points set to adaptive and we have this angle, depending on these settings we will get more points in between these points, and that is not what I want, of course. So what I'm going to do is right click in my viewport and set all of these points to hard interpolation. Now let's go ahead and create some geometry. With the spline selected, hold down the Alt key and create an extrude NURBS, and by holding down the Alt key you will automatically make the spline a child of the extrude NURBS object. Let me switch to the perspective view here, hit O on the keyboard to center the object, and I want to switch the display to road shading lines. You can find all of your display options here in the display menu of your viewport. So right now this outer frame is a bit thin. If we take a look at the reference images, you can see this outer frame has quite a bit of depth, and I thought maybe something like 200 centimeters would look okay. Okay, so let's go ahead and enter 200, and we can always change that later on if we have to, but for now I think that's a good depth. But of course, since we're going to mirror this front half over to the back later on, we only need half that depth, so let's change that to 100 centimeters. What I also want to do is get rid of this cap at the back, because this is going to be our mirror plane where the object will be mirrored over from the front to the back, so we don't want any geometry there. Let's select the extrude NURBS object, and on the caps tab you can switch off the end cap here. And now we can make this object editable, and this will result in two separate objects. And now we can select both of these objects, right click in the object manager and select connect objects and delete. And this will merge these two objects, but if I switch to polygon mode, and by the way, if you're in one of these modes, you can use the enter key to quickly toggle between them. I'm going to grab the live selection tool and select this n-gon here at the front, and if I move that along the z-axis, you can see the geometry is not connected. So what we need to do is optimize the object. And whenever you want to optimize an entire object, you need to make sure that you either select everything or nothing, because if you only select a couple of polygons here, optimization will only be carried out on the selected polygons. So let's go ahead and select all of the polygons here, right click in the viewport, and optimize is outside of the recording screen. So let me just switch to point mode here, select all of the points and right click in my viewport, and you can see optimize down here. And in this case we can use the default settings. If I bring up the options window here, what you see here is the default settings for optimizing objects. So let's just hit OK, and this will reduce the number of points to 44. If I switch back to polygon mode and select this n-gon here again and move it along the z-axis, you can see the geometry has been connected. Let's go ahead and select this polygon and delete it. Again, this is our mirror plane where the object will be mirrored over from the left to the right, so we don't want any geometry here. And I also want to delete this polygon down here, because if you take a look at the renders I did, we will have this skirting board around the blast door, and the bottom of the outer frame will be hidden behind this skirting board, so there's no point really in creating or keeping any geometry down here. Let's go back to the front view. What I want to do next is create those beveled corners along the outside and along the inside of the outer frame. So let's switch to edge mode here. I'm going to hit O on my keyboard to center the object on in my viewport. And I'm going to use the loop selection tool, and I want to switch off stop at boundary edges here to be able to select these edges. Let me zoom in a bit. And now we can right click and select bevel from the menu here. And now we can just left click and drag, and let's make this an offset of maybe 12 centimeters. And you can see that beveling these edges has created a lot of other geometry that I don't want right now, so I'm going to switch off create n-gons for the bevel tool. Let's go back to the front view, hit O to center the object in the viewport, and I'm going to use the loop selection again to select these edges here. Let's zoom in, grab the bevel tool again, left click and drag, and let's make this an offset of approximately 10 centimeters. You can see that beveling these edges has changed the look of the object a bit. We're getting this weird shading here. And this is because Cinema 4D tries to smooth the geometry depending on the settings of your Phong tag. So basically, the shading is caused by the Phong angle here, which is too high. So let's go ahead and reduce the Phong angle to maybe 43 or something, just to get rid of this shading. And we may have to increase that Phong angle again once we subdivide the object, because if the Phong angle is too low, the object may look faceted when you put it in a HyperNURBS object. And that is the basic shape of the outer frame. What I want to do now is add some control edges that will help hold the shape of this object when we subdivide it. Now, before we add those control edges, let's rename this object to outer frame. And I want to delete the UV tag here and the selection tag, which are both useless. So with the outer frame selected, hold down the Alt key and let's create a HyperNURBS object. Okay, this is not looking too good right now because we have this n-gon here and we don't have any control edges. So let's go ahead and switch the HyperNURBS off. You can do that by switching it off here in the Object Manager. A quicker way of doing it is using a shortcut, which is the Q key, and this Q key works for most of the generators here. So as long as you have the HyperNURBS or its child selected, hitting the Q key will toggle the HyperNURBS on and off. So let's go ahead and create some control edges. There's one thing I'd like to mention. When creating control edges, I usually don't use the bevel tool. And the reason for that is because beveling often changes the basic shape of the object, and that can lead to problems later on when you need to tweak the control edges or remove them. Chances are by doing that you'll also change the shape, the basic shape of the object, and you don't want that to happen. That can be difficult and time consuming to fix depending on how complex your model is. So I prefer to use edge cut or loop cuts or the knife tool, basically anything except for the bevel tool. In this case, For the first control edge, I'm going to use edge cut. And first of all, we need to select some edges. So let's grab the ring selection, and I want to select these 3 edges here. Let's zoom into this corner here, right click, and you can select edge cut from the menu here. I want to switch off create n-gons in this case. And the way edge cut works, if you want to use keyboard shortcuts, is you left click in your viewport, and by default this will create one subdivision. Now if you keep holding down the left mouse button, you can drag to the right to add subdivisions, or you can drag to the left to reduce the number of subdivisions. Let's go ahead and create 2 subdivisions here. Now you can also hold down the shift key, and if you drag now, you can scale these edges. Or you could hold down the control key and slide these edges into position. And you can also do this using the attributes manager, but I find it much more comfortable to be able to do that directly and interactively in the viewport here. Let's hit Ctrl Z to go back a step, and left click again, hold down the left mouse button, drag to the left because I only want to create one subdivision, and I'm going to hold down the control key and slide this edge over to here. Something like this. And I'm going to do the same thing down here, so let's grab the ring selection tool to select all of these edges here. And I'm going to switch to my edge cut tool, left click in the viewport, create one subdivision, hold down the control key and slide this over to here. Now let's just say, for the sake of argument, that I want a specific distance between these 2 edges. You can see in the coordinates manager right now they're spaced apart 3.08 centimeters. Let's say we want to make the distance between these edges 4 centimeters. What we can do is use the loop selection tool to select this edge loop here, and we can use the live selection, hold down the shift key and select this edge at the front here. Let me switch to the top view, and I'm going to switch to road shading lines here. Now if I scale these edges to get that distance, you can see that both this edge loop and this edge are moved, and I don't want to change the position of this edge here. So what we can do is go to the modeling axis and move the z-axis all the way down to -100% so that it sits on this edge here. And now if I scale, only the edge loop is being moved, and this edge here, the position of this edge here is not affected. So now we can just enter 4 centimeters in the coordinates manager, hit apply, and we're getting the exact distance that we want without changing the shape of the object here. And we can go ahead and do the same thing down here. So let's just loop select both of these edge loops here, and hit T for scale again, and let's change the size on the z-axis to 4 centimeters, hit OK, and now we have 2 consistent edge loops down here and up here. Next I want to add some control edges on this n-gon here, and we can't really use edge cut or the loop knife. I'm going to use a slightly different technique to make this as easy, to be able to create these edges as easily as possible. So I'm going to switch to polygon mode here, and I'm going to use the live selection tool. Right click in my viewport and select extrude inner. And now we can just left click and drag in the viewport. Let's also do an offset of 4 centimeters here. So this is a nice and easy way of getting nice and even edge loops on more complicated surfaces like n-gons. Let's go ahead and switch to the front view, and we need to get rid of some of the geometry that we've created, so I'm going to switch to my rectangle selection tool here. Let's reset the z-axis to 0. Let's go to the Options tab, and I want to switch off only select visible elements. Let's select this polygon at the front here and delete it, and I'm going to switch to point mode, select these points, hit T for scale, left click and drag on the x-axis, hold down the shift key, scale them down to 0, then I'm just going to move them to 0 on the x-axis. And now we need to do the same thing down here, so let's just go back to polygon mode and select this polygon down here, delete it, switch to point mode, select these points, hit T for scale, scale them down on the y-axis and move them to 0 on the y-axis. Now let's go ahead and hit the Q key to switch on the Hypernerbs object to see how things look. And it's still a bit messy, but we're getting a first general impression of how these edges look, and I think they're still way too soft. So we're going to have to add more control edges in between these two edges here and these two edges. But right now I don't want to do that, because having too much geometry will probably cause problems, especially with those extrusions here and here. So I'd rather wait and add those control edges later. What I do want to do though is, if I switch the Hypernerbs back on, this corner section here is still way too round, so I'm going to change the geometry here. Let's zoom into this corner, hit K for the knife tool, and I'm using the knife tool in line mode. I want to switch off restrict to selection and visible only, and then I'm going to, let me just switch off the reference image for a second here. And now I can snap the knife tool to this point here, hold down the shift key to create a straight cut all the way up to here, and I also want to create a cut from here all the way over to here. And now we can use the rectangle selection tool, grab these edges at the top and move them over a bit to tighten up this corner section. And I'm going to select these edges on the side and move them up as well. And now we can use the live selection tool, select this edge and remove it by right clicking in the viewport and selecting dissolve from the menu. Let's go back to the perspective view and hit Q to switch the Hypernerbs back on. So we've tightened this corner up quite a bit and things are looking okay for now. And this is the finished basic shape of the outer frame. In the next lesson we're going to create more geometry, split this object up into a number of more manageable sections, and we're going to create the geometry we need to model all of the details into the geometry of this outer frame.